So, hello everyone, and welcome to the book launch for Disaster Resilience in South Asia, tackling the odds on subcontinental fringes. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in all over the world. I know that in some places it's very early morning, it could be late at night, so I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your day. We have people from the US, the UK, and I'm sure that there's some tuning in from South Asia as well. So my name is Thomas Johnson, and I'm Associate Lecturer here at the University of Newcastle, and I'm going to host this event. I'm very happy to be a part of this event because my research is very closely aligned with the themes in this book. I focus on disaster vulnerability of displaced people, and my case study for my PhD research is based in Bangladesh. So it's based in South Asia and deals with disaster resilience. So I'm very excited to be part of this book launch. I've known the three authors for a very long time, for many years now, firstly as teachers, as mentors, as friends, and now colleagues. So thank you very much for involving me in this event. Before we get started, I'd like to say that this session is going to be recorded. So when we get to the point where we get to ask some questions, if you don't feel comfortable having your camera on or your microphone unmuted, you can just use the chat box to enter your questions that way. So before we get started, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Pumbalong clan of the Awabakal Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So we're on the Callaghan campus at the University of Newcastle, but we also have a campus in the city, which is on the Awabakal and Worimi nations, in the Central Coast, which is on the traditional land of the Darkinung people, and Port Macquarie, which is on the land of the Biripi people. So I'd like to invite you now to pay the respects to the people, the traditional custodians of the land which you were on, if you were on Indigenous land. So go ahead and write into the chat box where you are joining from. It'd be really interesting to pay our respects, but to also see where everybody is tuning in from today. I'd also like to say that the University of Newcastle values inclusive communities, and all events hosted here are governed by our organisational code of conduct. Upholding these values requires individuals to maintain an awareness of their own conduct, interaction with others, and willingness to intervene directly where the conduct of others impacts negatively on participants. So if any issues arise at this event that make you feel uncomfortable, don't hesitate to raise the issue or contact us directly. So these statements on traditional owners and on diversity are commonplace at any of the events that we host here at the University of Newcastle. But it has a very special significance when we're talking about disaster resilience. We often find that the most vulnerable people to disasters are part of marginalised groups. And we often see that one of the keys to building resilience is through harnessing traditional knowledge and customs. So it's important to remember this whenever we're discussing disaster resilience. So I'd like to get started with the launch. So we're here to launch the book, Disaster Resilience in South Asia, Tackling the Odds in the Subcontinental Fringes. This book explores the challenges of building disaster resilience in South Asia. This is a region that frequently experiences some of the most severe and devastating impacts of disasters. It's divided into 7 key chapters, 5 of which are focusing on particular countries in South Asia. So it explores disaster resilience in Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. We're going to start this event with some opening remarks from our guests of honour, Professor Dalanthi Amaratunga, and followed by Professor Ben Weisler, who wrote the foreword for this book. We'll then hear from the authors of the book, and we'll have a chance to ask some questions at the end. So I'd like to introduce Professor Dalanthi Amaratunga. She's from the Global Disaster Resilience Centre at the University of Huddersfield. She's a leading international expert in disaster resilience with an extensive academic career that has a strong commitment to encouraging colleagues and students to fulfil their full potential. She provides expert advice on disaster resilience to national and local governments and international agencies, including the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. She's engaged in many significant research projects around the world, particularly in Asia in partnership with key academic and organizational stakeholders. Among many leadership roles, she is the Joint Chief Editor of the International Journal on Disaster Resilience and the Built Environment, and the Chair of the International Conference on Building Resilience series, which she co-created. So over to you, Professor Lankan.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Tom. So dear friends and colleagues, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it gives me great pleasure to be here. My thanks to Iftekhar Ahmed for inviting me to give the opening remarks at this very special occasion. The launch of the book takes place today is with the title Disaster Resilience in South Asia, edited by Iftekhar Ahmed, Maund, and Thayaparan Gajendran from University of Newcastle, Australia, as we all just heard. I must say that I feel very much at home here at this event, not only because the book that is being launched today is based around South Asia, but also the new discoveries that is highlighted in this book are very close to my heart, having collaborated with the region for over 25 years. In Sri Lanka, where I come from, could easily become your favorite island in the world. This is an important book which considers the challenges of building resilience in South Asia, a region that frequently experiences some of the most severe and devastating impacts of disasters, while placing the current day disaster risk reduction and management profession into context. I am sure this must be making the co-authors very proud of their achievement, and rightly so. It is by taking steps like this that we will move towards what we want to achieve. As you read the chapters of this book, it is not unnoticed that the book offers a collective understanding of practice, which can offer lessons to a world increasingly beset by disasters and with uncertain environmental futures linking to 5 small South Asian countries: Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. This book is written encompassing disaster resilience in 2 unique ways, in my view. The collection of nations in terms of disaster resilience is a true combination of the smaller South Asian countries. And secondly, it uses multiple lenses to study disaster resilience, encompassing unique methodologies to explore resilience issues in each country. The devastating and high-profile disasters that occur across these smaller nations continue to raise awareness of the importance of building capacity and reducing vulnerability. They have spurred significant institutional and community interest and activity in these countries on disaster resilience initiatives. Research endeavors identified within this book will undoubtedly assist in achieving these outcomes through knowledge dissemination and identifying challenges, as well as barriers and enablers to change. In closing, I would like to acknowledge that all the efforts of the co-authors, who perhaps wrote this book with the hope that we, as readers, will take away new knowledge about disaster resilience, and above all, will take away the knowledge of advancing community resilience and capacity building through an exploration of different aspects of governance and policy, recognizing the diversity of the South Asian countries and recent disasters. Considering the depth of knowledge and careful consideration of individual experiences within the book, there's absolutely no doubt that this will be the case. I wish you all the success with this very interesting book. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lankan. I would now like to introduce Professor Dan Weisler, who wrote the foreword for this book. So Professor Dan Weisler is from the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction at the University College London and the Environmental Studies program from Oberlin College, Ohio. He has worked for more than 50 years on the interface between village and neighborhood scale vernacular knowledge and its application to resource management and risk management, and the critique of national and international policy and practice where it fails to acknowledge, respect, and learn from villages and neighborhoods, or worse, oppresses and exploits them through top-down impositions that make local action more difficult. His significant work include Power and Need in Africa, and he's the co-author of At Risk and the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Natural Hazards and Disaster Reduction. So over to you, Professor Dan Weisler.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. I'm very happy to celebrate the publication of this book and to congratulate the three editors and the authors. I was honored to be able to write the foreword, to be asked to write the foreword. And I speak today 2 hours before sunrise on my small patch of the planet. I'm physically distant from South Asia and most of you at the book launch. Professionally, I'm also somewhat remote. Much of my work on disaster reduction and development studies has occurred in Eastern and Southern Africa, in Central and South America, and the Caribbean. I've spent time in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal, but I'm not an area specialist or an expert. I believe that is precisely why Dr. Iftekhar Ahmed asked me to write the foreword in the first place, and again, why he invited me to participate in the book launch. My enthusiasm for the book is based on what I see as the application of its findings for many small countries on the continental fringes, as the subtitle of the book says. In this case, on the continental fringes of Africa and the Americas. Indeed, there are also likely implications and applications for smaller, under-resourced provinces and regions within large countries such as Brazil, where I'm currently working. So that is the first point I want to make about this book. It is much more than a set of specialist case studies about relatively small countries, despite appearances. Glacial lake outburst floods and building codes do, of course, raise technical and specialist issues. Likewise, in terms of geopolitical influence and world trade, these 5 countries are indeed small. But there are themes that run through these chapters that raise very large and significant issues. Firstly, one sees that within the constraints of meager domestic economic resources, when compared to regional economic giants, India and China, these 5 have been able to build their own approaches to the hazards they face. Secondly, 3 of the 5 countries managed to increase economic equality among their citizens since 1980. Maldives, Bhutan, and Nepal are these countries. This is all the more impressive given the huge losses that Maldives suffered in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and Nepal from the 2015 Gorkha earthquake. This leads me to a third distinctive observation that makes the book relevant far from South Asia. The definition of resilience used in these chapters emphasizes transformation and uplift of basic conditions of life and livelihood. It is not a narrow definition, but a broad one. All these positive achievements, however, all these are positive achievements. However, the authors and editors have also highlighted continuing challenges and constraints. One of these challenges is negotiation with donors in order to ensure domestic capacity and to avoid the trap of aid dependency. Rebuilding after large tsunami and earthquake disasters clearly requires outside assistance. So there are lessons here on how this process can result not simply in rebuilding of bricks and mortar, but in the creation of long-lasting local institutions. The other ongoing constraint involves a suite of socio-political processes that will be familiar to African and Latin American colleagues. The editors list these on page 8. poverty, inadequate governance, unplanned urbanization, endemic corruption, pressure on limited resources, inequitable power and resources distribution, land degradation, overexploitation of natural assets, and pollution. This is an honest, clear-sighted book. It is neither triumphalist nor catastrophist. Reality is in the middle, in the day-to-day work of civil servants, NGO staff, and citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Dan Weisler. We'll now move on to our authors. So I'd like to introduce, firstly, next to me on the left is Associate Professor Iftekhar Ahmed. He's an Associate Professor at the University of Newcastle. His research focuses on disaster resilience, post-disaster housing, and climate change adaptation. He's co-authored the book Sustainable Housing Reconstruction and co-edited the book Community Engagement in Post-Disaster Recovery. We also have Dr. Kim Maund down the end. She is the Head of Discipline and a Senior Lecturer in Construction Management at the University of Newcastle. With more than 15 years industry experience across government and private sectors, her research focuses on policy within the built environment, particularly in relation to urban planning and building codes in the context of disaster resilience. And we have Associate Professor Dayaparan Gajendran. He is an Associate Professor at the University of Newcastle. His research focuses on cultural and governance approaches for building resilience. He has authored many research publications in the area of disaster risk communication and disaster governance. So I'll open the floor to questions very soon, but first of all, I'll ask some opening questions. So first to you, Ifti, what inspired you to write this book?
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the keynote speeches by Dr. Amaratunga and Professor Amaratunga, I'm sorry, and Professor Dan Weisler. So just to quickly say, that's a very interesting question, what inspired us? Of course, unless you're inspired, one wouldn't write a book. Okay? So that's definitely an issue. But what we drew on is an existing body of research that we have been working on over the years before the culmination of this particular project. So we had projects around the region in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Bangladesh. Some of these countries we were not familiar with, but we decided to include them because we saw a kind of scenario spreading across these smaller countries. So we kind of did that. So building on the existing research, but this also touches on our own experience, our knowledge of the region. Two of us, my colleague Gajendran and myself, we are actually from South Asia. Gajendran is from Sri Lanka, I'm originally from Bangladesh. So we kind of thought that we have this familiarity in this context. So let's just take on board this new endeavor. So that's that. And the other one is that looking at that region, we saw that there is a need for collating these somewhat scattered disaster resilience experiences, to get them together into one source, one book, which talks about the commonalities, yet the unique lessons that are offered by these different countries. So that's that. But before I go into any more discussion, I think I'd like to show a few photographs. I think pictures tell 1,000 stories, as the old saying goes, but also to give a little bit of context, I think, not to make it too abstract. And I know Ben mentioned that he's far from the context. So just to show you a few photographs, this book essentially builds on certain case studies of disaster resilience related projects. So this one is from Bangladesh, and you can see these people, they are assiduously rebuilding the embankments which were destroyed by a cyclone. And this is under what they call the Comprehensive Disaster Management Program, which was a very, very large 10-year program, multi-sectoral. And that's why it's comprehensive. But I won't go into that program, but you can see the kind of efforts these people are taking, just waist deep in water and rebuilding up their community. Can you go to the next one, please? And this is a photograph from Bhutan. Similarly, in this particular case, Bhutan experiences these unique disasters, glacial lake outburst floods. And I won't go into great detail, but these glacial lakes are actually expanding because of glacial melt due to climate change. And so these lakes overtop their banks and flood downstream. So in this particular case, again, you can see how hard these people are working. They have actually dug this lake, called Tormi Lake, by about deepening the bed of the lake by 5 meters, just simply using things like pickaxes. And this is at 5,000 meters above sea level, at a very high altitude. So you can imagine the kind of effort. It's very remote as well, taking days to get there without any transport, riding on mules and horses. So you can imagine, and then they have actually reduced their disaster risk by doing this kind of thing. So, and the next one, please. All going to the Maldives, and here this is an entirely new island, what they call a safe island, built by relocating people from an island that is completely devastated and actually washed out by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and the whole range of services and all kinds of efforts invested in building this into a habitable community. Next one, please. And in Nepal, looking at building codes, and after the 2015 earthquakes, that came into prominence, how important building codes are in saving lives and protecting assets. So this is just a simple photograph showing that those lateral struts, as you can see, running across the buildings and giving them disaster resilience. This is actually a temple which they rebuilt after the earthquake. And the next one. And then on to Sri Lanka, the last case study country. And this is a photograph from the devastation that happened after the 2017 landslides and floods in Ratnapura district. And our colleague Dilanti will be able to tell us more about this because of all the stuff that happened. The case studies commenced after we did our investigation on media and policy discourses on these disasters, and now there are massive resettlement relocation programs, and perhaps Dilanti can touch on it when she comes into the Q&A. So saying all that, look, I don't want to pose a rosy picture. I think looking at the photograph, what I'm saying is that yes, these are indeed remarkable efforts, but those odds which Ben Weisler touched on, they are tremendous, very strong systemic and institutional challenges that prevail throughout these countries, and kind of impedes all these efforts in building resilience. And so these case studies are actually all the more remarkable because of these existing challenges. So I think that is perhaps what truly inspired us to write this.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Kim, who is this book for? Who should be reading this book?
Thanks, Tom. I'd like to thank both our professors as well for the wonderful introduction that you've provided. As Tom mentioned earlier, my background is in urban planning and building codes, and so to be involved with the countries in this particular book and the case studies and the type of diversity that we had in terms of the different events that occurred was just an honour for me. So that was really appreciated. It was a great learning experience as well. In terms of the book, it's a really valuable resource for a range of practitioners, for a range of academics and students alike, particularly those that are working in the disaster risk resilience area, but also like myself in the policy area as well, because we have the opportunity to look at the initiatives that are implemented, to look at the strengths, and then to look at how we can build upon those strengths, but also look at the weaknesses and how we can move forward to build our resilient cities and communities. So there are 3 points here, and Professor Weisler touched on these as well, about why I think the book's quite unique and valuable. And the first is the collection of nations and the combination of those smaller South Asian countries and the disaster resilience, and it provides a really unique insight into what's happening at the ground level, what's happening at the policy level. And also the DRR, the concepts around that are derived from the local actors and the institutional actors, and that's really important. So it's not our opinion, it's the information that we're actually getting back from the local communities and the actors to understand what's happening at that, that operational side. One of the other ones relates to the use of the multiple lenses, or social lenses, as we call them, to study disaster resilience, and that provide a range of unique methodologies. So not every case study is the same. They come with a diversity of locations and events that have occurred, and that provides us with a really interesting understanding of what's happening across the region. And importantly, the different case studies help us with moving forward with our policy and our operations in practice. So I think the devastating and high-profile disasters that we actually look at in this text resulted in significant DRR and activities and initiatives, and the book helps us achieve the goals of those. And by what I mean in that respect is that we're helping to disseminate information, to help with learning, to help with understanding what's happening out there in industry in a practical sense and on the ground. And I think the challenges faced by the local actors can be looked at and understood. So it's a matter of looking at the barriers, but also the enablers and what actually worked really well in some of these case studies. And if I take Sri Lanka, for example, although there were some areas that probably could do with some strengthening, there was absolutely amazing success stories that came out as well. And one of them that comes to mind was how there were some educational programs with school children about landslides or warning signs. And what came from that was in one particular school, a number of the local school children actually noticed the ground movement and what was happening with the vegetation. And they were actually very fortunate in that through that awareness, we're able to evacuate that school ground area before there was a landslip. So, you know, to hear those wonderful stories coming from local communities was really amazing. So it just demonstrates as well throughout the book that there are some wonderful successes and these have to be looked at as well.
Thank you, Kim. And Gajendra, I'd like to ask you, the book focuses on South Asia. What was it that made you specifically focus on this region?
Thank you, Tom. And I would like to thank both the professors, Professor Maldives and Professor Weisler, for taking the time and attending this event, and also all the participants. I think my co-authors have partly answered that question, and Professor Weisler also has kind of given a very detailed account of the region, but I'll kind of build on that. So when we talk about disasters, it has become a very complex phenomenon. It is, you know, you could see it as a hazard that hitting a particular region and an area and the carnage it causes, or you could look at from a very different perspective of geographical, meteorological aspects to demographic, cultural aspects, and social, socio-economic and political governance aspects. So I think this applies to any region, but why specifically this region is that some of these are post-rationalization, because originally we started with the body of knowledge we have, the connections we have, and some passion we have in the region. But if you really step back and look at it, Professor Weisler put some interesting concepts around it, and Professor Ahmed talked about this multiple perspectives. So the unique nature of the geographical terrain and the disruptions facing the normality due to the multiple hazards like tsunamis, flooding, heat waves in the region is unique. So every case study we looked at different hazard. So in that way, this region provides an opportunity to look at disaster resilience through different hazards, but some countries have a multitude of hazards. So we have kind of discussed that. So in that sense, it's unique. The major one is that all these countries are developing countries. This South Asia bloc is 1.8 billion in population with 8 countries. And if you take India out, still it is significant population bloc around the world. I think it's the highest population bloc, and the population density is very, it's about 362 people per square kilometer. So I think this is the highest dense place. And there is rapid urbanization. At the same time, there is significant rural population. So building disaster resilience in this diverse, kind of demographic setup is challenging. So this region gives us opportunity to look into that. And also, if you look at the urbanization, which causes unplanned cities developing with urban sprawl and urban poor, while on the other hand, rural areas not having enough support. And these things gives us an opportunity to really look at the cost of developing disaster resilience compared to looking at a developing country, which may have a different sets of problems. And also, these countries have long histories and significant cultural diversity, and probably cultural heritage as well. So these countries seem to have fractured governance, affecting, actually managing the long-term resilience. And also some of these countries have emerged from long-term conflict. So, you know, in itself is a disaster. And then, you know, on top of it, we are looking at, you know, natural hazard-based disaster. So this region kind of provides that demographic cultural aspects to study as well. Then the important part comes, and Professor Weisler talked about inequality and how some countries have developed, you know, better kind of improve the inequality. But smaller nations are all developing economies with a very strong, probably pushed by a little bit of a neoliberal agenda. So, but still, on average, there is 10% still living under the poverty line. Okay. So building disaster resilience in terms of urban wealthy areas versus, you know, people who are under poverty is kind of something we tackle in the book. But on the other hand, DRR initiatives are contingent on the foreign aid and lack of local capacity, and also in some places there's no clear agenda to develop capacities. Was one thing that gives us the opportunity to study resilience in a more detailed manner. So it's important that although economic development is happening, we have to be careful that it doesn't create inequality, and particularly disasters have proven to create this inequality by you know, distribution of income or distribution of aid being you know, not being very reasonably planned, and also trying to reduce the disaster risks have created new risks in some areas as well. So building disaster resilience in these 5 countries, particularly in the South Asian bloc, I think gave us a good opportunity to kind of look at the disaster resilience definition and the aspects of resilience rather than purely focusing on the structural measures. We fairly focused on both structural and a lot of non-structural measures. So I think in that sense, this region was really an attractive region to study disaster resilience and create knowledge and disseminate knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now I'll open the floor to questions from our audience. You can feel free to put on your video and unmute your microphone if you'd like, or you can type into the chat box as well. Notice throughout the presentation, a few people have posted in the chat box to say where they're tuning in from. It's really great to see. We have people coming from Indonesia, Nepal. I think I saw Solomon Islands.
And just the UK.
Yeah, quite a few different places. So it's great to see. And also anyone in the room can feel free to ask questions to our authors.
There was a question from Misbah at the very beginning who would like to know, why is there nothing about Pakistan in the book?
Should I? Yeah. Let me answer that. Misbah, is that we actually thought of including Pakistan, but on 2 grounds we did. One is that it is not a small country like the others, so it has its own vulnerabilities and its own challenges for sure. But we wanted to focus on the smaller countries of the region. That is one area. The other one was, but we could have kind of overcome that a little, but the problem was to actually travel to Pakistan and getting the data. We didn't have any existing research project there, and that would be difficult for us to get permission to do that. It would encounter a lot of obstacles, and there are these risk ratings and all that, and we eventually had to abandon that idea. We also thought of Afghanistan, but similarly for that reason we couldn't. India we didn't, definitely, because it's a very large country with diverse conditions within it, and they wouldn't have fit into our narrative. Hope that answers your question. Sorry we didn't include Pakistan, but maybe the next book.
Next time. Yeah. Book 2.
We have one more come up. So I'm doing the whole thing.
Question to Professor Ifti. What are the common cultural practices in South Asia for DRR?
Social practices. Interesting. That's a very interesting question. I think my colleague Gajendran talked about it, and then Basant, I know that you are from Nepal and you perhaps know the answer to your question. We are steeped in tradition. I think there's a long cultural heritage, but also I think that cultural heritage has an inbuilt social stratification, if that's the word for it. Inequity is actually built into the social structure. That is the culture, this hierarchy. this kind of, hierarchy amongst the old and the young, hierarchy between the rich and the poor, even people being discriminated on the tone of their skin. I'm not talking about color. So I think, so having that particular baggage, even then, and again, it's an odd which people surmount. They kind of overcome that odd by saying that, okay, we have the challenge, but yet we'll work together, we'll cooperate, we'll collaborate, we will do things together. Those photos that I showed you, where people actually are into the water and icy cold water in Bhutan, digging with pickaxes, that shows the culture. That is perhaps the basis of resilience. I think if you drill down to the bottom of what is actually resilience, that is what it is. It's people, it's their cooperation, their willingness to give up their values for a common good. I think, yeah, I can keep going unless you want to add any more.
No, I think that's that's a crust of it. Cultural practices are central to building resilience, and sometimes certain cultures are imported through NGOs to work in a particular practice, but certain traditional practices come from indigenous nature, indigenous to the communities. And some of the practices are good communication, long-term planning, making sure that getting prepared for the next disaster, taking the vulnerable with them. So these are some of the community practices we saw not only in these regions, but in Fiji and other places, the indigenous nature of it. But the key thing is communication, I think, because not every, in the current climate change kind of driven disaster things, people need to have early warning systems, and people have to be informed adequately to be prepared with their cultural practices. Sometimes some of the cultural practices may not be adequate to deal with that. So I think adding to that point, not only the cultural practices would be adequate in the current situation, there needs to be some form of institutional mechanism from a government or from other organization to help people to give adequate and relevant information for them to be prepared for the future.
The only thing I would add on top of that, I think you've answered perfectly, was just the social and cultural issues that you've mentioned, but we also have to consider that with the different layers that we have. So the local level communities, whether it be the NGOs, whether we're talking about the government policy writers, whatever it is, there's also different cultures that operate within those, and we have to look at the coordination and communication with those particular agents in this particular process if it's going to work correctly to help local communities. Sorry, Ben, you had a question?
Good. Well, just to enlarge on what's been said, certainly in many cultures there is a history and a propensity for cooperation, especially in times of great need. On the other hand, there also are in South Asian countries and elsewhere in the world various socioeconomic processes that differentiate people. And isn't there a danger, a potential trap in romanticizing or overemphasizing the community? In fact, some people, for instance, one of my other colleagues, together with Ian Davis, in the book At Risk, Terry Cannon actually really fully resists the whole concept of the community. He thinks the whole notion of community is overly general. And so I'm wondering what you found in relation to, say, landlords and the relationships between landlords and those people on the land, the tenants on the land, and other forms of differentiation that, without denying the underlying history of cooperation, how is that dynamic working out? The both differentiation and some conflict there, as well as cooperation. Did that also play out in your case studies?
Well, I can have a go at this very quickly. I think what you've touched on is very right. I kind of alluded to that in my response about the hierarchical structures that are in place. And even the word community is fraught with conceptual difficulties. And having said that, I think there still exists a semblance of community in all these places. Unlike many other so-called industrialized developed countries, which don't have a community in that sense of the word. But it is at loggerheads with these notions of hierarchy. To talk about hierarchy, in these countries, they have an institutional innovation, new ministries that have come into place. It would have been possible in the so-called developed country to just build a new ministry from scratch. And so, but then that has played out well in some countries. I see Sri Lanka is smiling because Sri Lanka is one of those two countries that have actually dedicated ministry for disaster risk reduction management, whatever you want to call it. So I think, yes, thou shalt cooperate, and people hence cooperate. I think that is perhaps right, but on the other hand, they still cooperate because of need, because the need to cooperate, because they know that the social capital lies. Essentially, the stakes are where we cooperate. If we don't, we'll fall away. So I think it's also perhaps necessity which drives this cooperation. It's not only institutional dictates or hierarchies.
I think community is a problematic word in many ways, because we were doing some work in Australia to look at flood resilience, and we had a town hall meeting and a few people attended, and we said, okay, tell us which communities are involved in this. And they were really struggling to say whether the people are outside the river were part of the community or whether, business part of the community. So, they basically saw they were a community group, but when we asked them where should we draw the boundaries, it became really difficult. But on the other hand, the common discourse in government policy and funding applications and all sorts of things that in any country, community is the unifying term these days. So you apply for funding for developing a community or apply a fund for cultural activity in a community. So the issue in developing countries, as we said, communities are generally drawn around discriminatory practices in the past. So what I'm trying to say is that the communities were developing based on some form of discrimination, which allowed sometimes power to be used by one community over the other. And the government institutions are trying to kind of break them as much as possible. But I'm sure there are Nepali colleagues here. But one of the case study there was that when the rations were given, there was clearly a priority for the people who were giving it to their communities, and actually not equally distributing for the needed people. And here the community comes in. So why is this particular people who are actually distributing the ration are looking after a particular group of people because they think they belong to that community and not the other? So this was evidence in other papers as well. So I don't know what is the answer to this, but I clearly see some form of institutional monitoring is a way to break some of these strong cultural community norms that have existed looking after a particular group of people. But if the adversity is so bad or the hazard has a tremendous impact, probably these things break away and people work together without seeing where they belong. And but in a way, individual agency is the one which we usually study. But this individual agency in a disaster scenario, particularly in the preparedness form, it is about their property, and if they don't own the property, what happens and who is responsible? This creates a lot of further level of discourse, which we haven't tackled in this book, but we do recognize it as a potential area, particularly in developing countries with deep cultural roots.
We have a few questions on the chat forum. One of them is for any of the authors. What is the most significant learning or insight you have learned while working on this book? This has come from Malau in the Philippines.
One thing for me is communication, and I'm sure I want Kim to follow up on that, because in institutional communication and communication at different levels.
I was genuinely surprised about the similarities. So such different localities, such different events that we were looking at, and yet there was there was a stream basically running through them that they all sort of looked at. There were certain issues around policy and around planning and about communication and early warning. Like there seemed to be a general theme running across all of them, and it was quite interesting to see that sort of, for such diverse case studies, to see that sort of that central line running through them. But in terms of communication, you know, that was a really interesting one, and I think that's applicable not just to these countries that we looked at here, but it's also in the Australian context as well. It's you know, it's common worldwide that we have to look at our communication, our coordination, and make sure our responses are timely and accurate, and make sure that you know, that we are working together. You know, we're talking about social and cultural issues then. You know, COVID's an amazing example, I think, of how together, you know, we've all come together to try and overcome this adversity that we're facing at the moment. So you can really see, you know, how communities can come together, if I may use that term, and how we can pull together then during these times. So if we can work that into our operational systems, I think that's absolutely amazing. I think, if I may again talk about the Sri Lankan case study, for example, there was some amazing work that was actually done there. And one of the important things was, though, that it was identified that early warning systems, they required stronger technology, or technology that had more processing capacity. And that was one of the areas that was identified that would have helped with more early warning systems, and also bringing those systems down onto a more local level rather than a regional level. So, you know, there were a range of different items like that that are really beneficial and really help us in moving forward and understanding where to from here. But if I may, I'd just like to stop for a moment, because I do know, Professor Amatunga, that you are very familiar with the Sri Lankan case studies and what's happening over in that region at the moment. And I would love to know, we wrote this book based upon 2017 and the flooding and landslide disasters in that context. And, you know, it was published last year, but I'd love to know from your perspective and hear what you think is happening and what is moving forward in that particular region at the moment in terms of DRR.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, you know, I don't know from where to start, to be honest with you. It's a very, very good question. I suppose, again, it's just a key component of DRR practices, particularly in Sri Lanka, is, I suppose, the political instability and also the impact that it has on the DRR governance structures. It is just very complicated. I suppose, of course, you know, Gajendran, I'm sure you are aware. It's just, you know, that is why I asked the question about the governance, because governance actually provides that backbone to manage the GDRR processes from national level to community. But when the structure is in such a chaotic situation, it is very, very difficult to do. And also, it is actually it generates problems in terms of who's actually accountable. There are a lot of people who like to have authority, but when it comes to being accountable for DRR, these chaotic governance structures actually doesn't help at all. So like even the early warning example that you picked up, for example, the IO wave Indian Ocean tsunami testing program was held last week, but again there was sort of like, you know, that testing program has been going on for several years now, but still with all the problems in terms of the governance and the accountability, it was actually quite complicated, and they couldn't actually long story short, the message didn't go to some parts of the country to say that it is a test. Yeah. So people start panicking, thinking that there's actually a real tsunami. So even very simple things like that. So in my view, I think in order to address other underlying issues, the governance structure needs very carefully considered and sorting. I agree with Ifti. Ifti identified that Sri Lanka has has a separate disaster management division. But again, the issue is due to this unstable political culture. It moves from one ministry to the other. So one week it is part of Ministry A, the next week it is part of another ministry. So there's absolutely no continuity. It is quite difficult, and I know it puts a lot of people in a very, very difficult situation, particularly the people who are sort of the policy related people on DRR. So these are, I think there are fundamental problems that need sorting in order to sort of look at the rest of the equation. And also the thinking about multi-hazard perspective actually. At the moment, of course, like, we are facing another pandemic, is the COVID. So how do you deal with other hazards during a pandemic? Because, for example, other hazards don't care whether there's a pandemic or not. What do you do if there's going to be a tsunami tomorrow? So there need to be actually arrangements in place to manage these very complicated cascading and systemic risks. I think it has actually created a much more complex situation in most of these countries. So I think there's a lot more to be done, particularly linking with the governance angle. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Just a brief outline, but I think that is actually the fundamental issue that needs sorting. Gajendran, don't know whether you want to add anything for that.
Yeah, I think absolutely, lack of governance structures based on instable politics is one of the key things in Southeast Asia. I think, I'm sure there are other countries, but this is very common to the Southeast region. And also, sometimes the lack of leadership within the country becomes problematic because they look for leadership for these areas from elsewhere. So the capacity building has to be imposed on them by someone else rather than it builds up from within the country's system. And that is a unique lesson also. So, and also sometimes waiting for handouts to really build the resilience becomes, a norm, and then the continuity of it becomes a problem. So lack of political will, political changes, unstable governance structures, along with looking for aid which looks for more stable government and clear agenda. So there's a conflict between them. So Nepal was a case that there was $14 billion ready for reconstruction, but the political instability there, delayed the reconstruction by a number of months, 4-6 months, and until then people were waiting there for things. So I absolutely agree with you. That's one of the biggest lessons in terms of South Asia. I'm sure there could be some other smaller countries in other regions might have this problem, but this is a very common problem in South Asia.
Thank you.
And also add to that very, very quickly to add to that, Gajendran, I think about the bureaucratic nature of decision making. That is the other issue. I found it astonishing to see that there need to be a memo that need to go from this room to the next room in terms of decision making, whereas I'm sure we actually deal with everything via email. But it doesn't mean that the systems aren't in place. For example, countries like Sri Lanka is quite advanced in terms of IT usage, but the government institutions where a lot of decision makers are based, particularly on DRR, they still use 18th century mechanisms. So it's just, it is actually not a joke. You really need to send a memo from the person in this room to the next room to take action. And imagine, it is
the problem communication protocol.
Yeah. Exactly. The protocols is just unbelievable. I think they all need a kind of a complete overhaul. So this is actually on Sri Lankan context, but I'm sure that the same thing applies to a lot of other countries in the region also, Gajendran. Yes, thank you.
Could I just say a word on behalf of the 18th century? There's a flip side to this. I think, is that with advanced IT and artificial intelligence and specialized GIS mapping and so forth, I think there's a tendency now for decision makers to fetishize this and not to question this. If the model says X, Y, Z, of course they're not. Why should we question that? It's the model is telling us this. I think we mustn't lose touch with ground truth. And why I say, just being a bit humorous about it, the words in favor of the 18th, certainly even perhaps let's say the 19th, early to mid 19th century, there are good old-fashioned ways of mapping that actually children should still learn in order to develop their sense of this is the terrain, this is our reality. And likewise, then, as adults and as bureaucrats who are passing these memos from room to room and keeping piles of memos wrapped up in red tape on shelves, they should know the difference between the map and the terrain. That's an important difference, The map is not the terrain. The people who live there and their mental maps and what you can get now with technology in real time with mobile phone participatory, mapping. This gets us closer to the reality than very, very sophisticated models. I was working in Los Angeles over a number of years when I was at Cal State Long Beach, and the city of Los Angeles had purchased a very sophisticated earthquake, real-time earthquake damage assessment model from a consulting firm. And this would tell the people in the operations center within a minute or two what the likely casualties, et cetera, would be in different parts of the city so they could allocate resources. Well, they found they needed to modify it. It was such a complicated model, they didn't have access to the proprietary software, you see, because they were trademarked. They couldn't modify it, so they had to fall back on sending out helicopters and getting mobile phone messages, etc. So I think, just as a caution, let's maintain that balance, don't you think?
Yes.
So I've seen many questions coming in through the chat, but unfortunately, to finish up on time, we might have to answer those through email. Are you happy to respond to these after the event? I'm sorry, I just don't want to keep anybody much longer than we scheduled for, given that there's these huge time differences. So just any final words from the authors, or is there anybody that you want to thank?
I think, let me thank you. I think that will be nice. But before I do that, sorry that we couldn't answer all those questions. I saw some of them, and some of them are people I know very well. So folks, write to me directly. I can answer those. Those of you know me, you have access to me. If you don't, you can find out who I am. Just Google Iftekhar Ahmed, University of Newcastle, you'll find me. So I'm more than happy to answer your questions. So I think some of those questions that you posed there, I can see they're really valuable. I would really love to engage, and all of us actually would love to engage in a discussion on those questions. Perhaps a follow-up forum. That's something we might eventually do. But just to quickly give thanks, I cannot give it quickly because there's just so many people we need to thank. Because you can understand, for a mission like this, it is quite an extensive engagement. It's a big endeavor. And to do that, there was just so many people who contributed. And I'm sorry if I leave anyone out. But firstly, all the different agencies, governmental and non-governmental, we've been creating some of them. But they have been actually forthcoming in giving access. Often when I thought oh, I probably won't get that information. They were all open. In all these countries, government officials willingly spoke to us, shared their resources, shared the information. So that is great, as well as NGOs. I think I still have to thank them. Yes, the memo was probably on its way to the next group, but at the same time, they didn't ignore a brush of team. So that helped, and us, Gajen as well, and Kim, all of us, and then some of the collaborating researchers, especially in these two countries, Nepal and Sri Lanka, because we had worked on projects which inform two of these chapters in this book. And I think most importantly, perhaps, are those at-risk disaster-affected communities who gave us their life stories, their information. They shared all their narratives and offered such valuable lessons. I mean, without them, this book wouldn't have been possible. Simply that. And these are people who are really busy, subsistence people in many cases, but yet they set aside time to talk to us with no expectation, because I told them at the beginning, we don't have any money for you. It's just to get your knowledge, to understand, and then they were more than willing. And all these countries, so that was great. Just thank our School of Architecture and Built Environment, SEBI, and especially our head of school, Suan Wei. I hope she's listening somewhere in this group. Even if not, she knows that we are grateful because of, again, giving us this time to indulge in it, to write, to pursue our passion. And not just say that, no, you should be, filling out this form at this moment, but no, we're writing this book, they supported us. They mollycoddled us, if that's the word for it, which we are more than, happy. And also some of these people within the school, Inia Jones, who is here, Jet Cranfield, both of them, they supported this launch in tremendous ways. Jet perhaps is very important because he made this really wonderful video, which some of you may have seen relating to this book and this launch. My colleagues, especially my co-authors, Kim and Gajen, of course, I can't thank them enough. I kept on hassling them so much, they kind of actually tolerated me. They got sick of me, but they tolerated me for
yeah, I can just imagine that, Ifti.
But it's not one-sided also, they did too at times.
Oh.
But that and also Tom Johnson, I think, for facilitating this event, but also being in constant support for this kind of mission. Our PhD scholars, some of them are sitting here. I think there are three of them, Rumana, Shumank, and Jerry, who's just stepped out, who actually contributed to parts of this book in writing the references and doing things like that. So thank you to you. And also our editor, Bastian Phelan. I think she's attending. And sometimes it's good to have an editor like that because she comes from a very different background, not disaster resilience, but she knows the weaknesses in our expressions, how we can craft language to convey our meaning in the most effective way. So, thank you, Phelan, Bastian, rather. And then, of course, Ben Weisler. We can't thank you enough for the forward, of course, for the book, but also continuously supporting us through all our different idiosyncrasies of trying to get this book as an open access book. For example, he was immediately supportive, and of course being supportive, waking up at this horrendous hour to join this launch. So Ben, we can't thank you enough. Great. And Duranti, of course. Duranti for all the support and everything, but also being our comrade in arms in this fight against disasters, and trying to, and being on the same page in addressing all the challenges and trying to do things. So that's there. One person who I haven't thanked in the book, and this note of regret, is Ilan Kilman. And Ilan Kilman is the series editor of this Routledge Studies in Hazards, Disasters and Climate Change. And he had provided very insightful and valuable feedback right at the inception of the book. And somehow it was my lapse in not recalling him. And then the staff of Routledge UK and Taylor and Francis, who are associated with this book at different stages, and particularly Nonita Saha, who is the editorial assistant for the book. She's based in South Asia and Delhi, and she has been continuously supporting us. And then I think, on a personal note, to thank our respective families. Again, they mollycoddled us. These guys are crazy. They just want to sit up at night and write this book. The whole holiday, they don't want to spend with us, they're just writing. Okay, we'll let them do it. So I think, we just can't thank them enough. Actually, my son also contributed to this book. I should just go a little bit personal in writing up some of the references. If you open the book, you see that some of those chapters have pages and pages of references, and it's such a boring task. And so some of our PhD scholars and others, they've actually helped us with that task. So I think I've covered everyone. Is there anyone you would like to?
I just want to thank Dilanthi again. I mean, the disaster group here started with some inspiration from you, and I remember writing 2 courses. I don't know whether you remember that for us in 2010. So thank you. I mean, we are able to grow significantly here based on the inspirations you gave us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gajendra. And of course, as you know, our friendship and our links go back to, I suppose, I don't know how many decades now.
Yeah.
So it's really good that you have actually set up this disaster group at Newcastle, and you're sort of progressing so well. It is very good to see. And of course, you hosted the Building Resilience Conference, and I think there have been a lot of milestones, and it is really good to see that your group is actually one of the leading groups in that part of the world for disasters. So keep going. I think it's very, very good to see. So I hope that we will be able to meet soon. Maybe that is my wishful thinking, but let's hope so. So congratulations. It's very, very good to see you guys. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add something very quickly before you go on? It's about Ben Weisler. I should tell you that I actually have to thank you for your at-risk book, 1994. I was doing my PhD in the UK in 1995, and I see one of the other authors of that book, Ian Davis, is also listening, who was also my external advisor for my PhD thesis. So I'm fortunate to have met you in person in 2011 in Geneva at the World Reconstruction Conference. And of course, in many, many occasions, Terry Cannon, I was lucky to meet. The only person I haven't met is Piers Blakey, and I think that's unfortunate, but I think people like you have inspired this journey, and it's at-risk is my Bible, or my Quran, or whatever you want to call it.
And from my side, if I can thank both of my co-authors as well, coming from the environment that I did, a regulatory environment with my policy background in building and planning, it was a real learning experience for me to step into this world, and it's been totally valuable. And to think that, the sharing of knowledge can actually potentially make a difference in people's lives is truly wonderful, and I think that's a really special thing. So thank you to both of you as well.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much for attending. Again, thank you to all the authors and our guests. The session has been recorded, so if you wanted to share it with anyone, please let us know and we'll provide you with the link. And we'll also try and get to all those questions that we unfortunately didn't have the time to answer tonight.
Thank you.
And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.